Good morning, everybody. Today I'm going to be reading from Acts chapter 10. In Caesarea, there was a man named Cornelius, a centurion of the Italian cohort, as it was called. He was a devout man who feared God with all his household. He gave alms generously to the people and prayed constantly to God. One afternoon, at about 3 o'clock, he had a vision in which he clearly saw an angel of God coming in and saying to him, "Cornelius." He stared at him in terror and said, "What is it, Lord?" He answered, "Your prayers and your alms have ascended as a memorial before God. Now send men to Joppa for a certain Simon who is called Peter. He is lodging with Simon a tanner whose house is by the seaside." When the angel who spoke to him had left, he called 2 of his slaves and a devout soldier from the ranks of those who served him, and after telling them everything, he sent them to Joppa. About noon the next day, as they were on their journey and approaching the city, Peter went up on the roof to pray. He became hungry and wanted something to eat, and while it was being prepared, he fell into a trance. He saw the heaven opened and something like a large sheet coming down, being lowered to the ground by its 4 corners. In it were all kinds of 4-footed creatures and reptiles and birds of the air. Then he heard a voice saying, "Get up, Peter, kill and eat." But Peter said, "By no means, Lord, for I have never eaten anything that is profane or unclean." The voice then said to him again a second time, "What God has made clean, you must not call profane." This happened 3 times, and the thing was suddenly taken up to heaven. Now while Peter was greatly puzzled about what to make of the vision that he had seen, suddenly the men sent by Cornelius appeared. They were asking for Simon's house and were standing by the gate. They called out to ask whether Simon, who was called Peter, was staying there. While Peter was thinking about the vision, the Spirit said to him, "Look, 3 men are searching for you. Now get up, go down, and go with them without hesitation, for I have sent them." So Peter went down to the men and said, "I'm the one you are looking for. What is the reason for your coming?" They answered, "Cornelius, a centurion, an upright and God-fearing man who is well spoken of by the whole Jewish nation, was directed by a holy angel to send for you to come to his house and to hear what you have to say." May God add a blessing to this reading. You're welcome.
Well, as we had talked about last week, and we sung, or Andrew sang for us a little bit ago, we talked about that story of Jacob wrestling with God, or with an angel, or with this mysterious sparring partner. And this is a way to set up this metaphor and this motif about wrestling with God, especially when it comes to matters of doubt in our faith. Now, it's not that we are championing doubt and saying that's the way to go. It's more just like as a part of an authentic expression of our faith. It's going to be natural that from time to time there will be doubts that seep in. And rather than suppress those doubts, we confront them, we address them, we wrestle with them, and we hopefully emerge stronger in our faith and more devout in our Christian life because we have done the hard work of doing that wrestling. So, let me ask you this as we prepare to get into the meat here of the sermon. Think of a time, if you can, that you started out with one position, one firmly entrenched idea, and somewhere over the course of your life, you did a 180 from where you started. Was there a time that you believed fervently or with your whole heart in one particular way of understanding or interpreting something, and then over time, maybe it was an event, maybe it was a discovery, maybe it was a relationship, maybe it was a book you read, whatever, but you did a 180 from where you originally began. Now, I think that is part of life experience, that is part of our condition as human beings, that we're going to have those things from time to time, and I want to assure you that you are in good company when it comes to doing those sort of 180s, particularly sometimes when it comes to matters of our faith. Let me give you several examples this morning. The first of which comes to us from the year 1633, when a man named Galileo fashioned himself the most powerful telescope ever created, probably at that time in human history. And while studying the cosmos, he came up with a theory that said, contrary to what we have been previously taught, particularly by the church, I have deduced through my telescopic views that the earth revolves around the sun, and not that all of the other planets in our solar system revolve around the earth. Now, he took his findings and he published them and he shared them and he began to talk about them and to teach them. But the church said, but that's contrary to what we read about in the scriptures. And now we have a dilemma. The church has theologically interpreted scripture, the Catholic Church at that time, in one particular way. But here is a person who says, yeah, but look through the telescope. I think you're going to find a different story. And I am pleased to say, well, not pleased to say, he was arrested, he was thrown in a dungeon. Not too long after, he was at least put on house arrest, where he remained for the rest of his life, where he continued to carry out scientific projects and publish scientific works. But he died outside of the good graces of the church that he loved. That was in 1633. In 1992, most of you remember 92, the church said, yeah, we got that one wrong. And that, I'm sure, I mean, it was, in fairness, it was the church doing the right thing and saying, we were wrong about that. And by the way, we're sorry for that. And just to hedge their bets a little bit, they said, but to be fair, there was blame on both sides. But they did the right thing by saying, in 1992, we're going to do a 180 on that and say, yeah, Galileo was right. And by the way, we don't see that teaching as a fundamental threat to the church any longer. We might have felt that way previously, but no longer. So the church did a 180. I am also happy to share with you that one of the fascinating things that we see as we read through the Bible is that the Bible will oftentimes do a 180 from a previous teaching or interpretation of the Bible, and we'll find that the Bible evolves or grows over the course of that time span, so that we find later on in the Bible there is a reinterpretation of something that took place earlier in the Bible. Now, I bring this up because one of the things that I wanted to address today, particularly as we're talking, having a conversation with this book that many of you are studying in the Sunday school hour, which we read a chapter, the second chapter, which was called The Good Book, ? And the idea is that many Christians who are willing to take on and willing to engage and wrestle with difficult biblical texts in order to have a more authentic faith have to get through texts that are unpleasant, troubling, or if we're being honest, we just wish that they weren't in the scripture. And those are texts like, for example, when it seems to be that God condones or celebrates massive acts of violence, where we see harm done to people who are marginalized, particularly, often case, a lot of times women in the Bible. We see very little with regard to slavery in the Bible, but when it is mentioned, it's just like, yeah, just part of life. And then there are other elements that we find woven throughout the scriptures that when we get to those places, we just say, ugh, I don't know what to do with that. And so we can either gloss over it and pretend it isn't there. We can either try to go to great lengths to make excuses for it. We can say, this book is antiquated and it doesn't have anything to speak to my modern life, and we set it aside and say it's no longer important to me. Or we do the thing that we are seeking to do now, which is sort of address some of these things, confront them, and find a way to work with them and to move past them or move along with them. So that's what we spent some time doing in our Sunday school hour today, but it's also what I want to talk a little bit about today, because one of the ways that we address Scripture is with Scripture. Let me give you I think, what is a powerful example. So in the book of Genesis, you may remember that there's a story about this man and this woman named Abram and Sarai, who later become Abraham and Sarah. And they are living in their camp in the desert, and they are visited by these mysterious visitors. Maybe angels, we don't know. It's another one of those sort of ambiguous texts. And Abraham and Sarah receive these visitors as they are supposed to, using ancient code for hospitality. They're following the rules. You welcome them into your home. You have been a traveler. You have been nomadic. You should welcome in a stranger. You should show them lavish hospitality, water their camels, fix a meal for them, allow them to stay with you for as long as necessary before seeing them off, packed and stocked for the remainder of their journey. And so they pour out this hospitality on them, and for their efforts, they receive a blessing, which is that even in their advanced age, they're going to have a family, and the family's going to grow, and their descendants will be as numerous as the stars. And then these mysterious visitors, they continue on down the road, and they go to the next village, where they come across a community called Sodom. And Sodom is where they experience the antithesis of the hospitality shown to them when they visited Abram and Sarai. The people there have no concern about the well-being of the visitors, but in fact ask themselves the questions, what can we do to show our dominance upon these people who are coming to visit our community? How can we show them that we are in control, that they are subservient to us, and pack them on their way so that if they get out alive, they will never forget what they experienced here. We had the upper hand. Now, this story of what happens in Sodom has been reinterpreted over the years, and even in biblical times, people zeroed in on one detail, which seemed to a lot of people talk about a sexual sin. But later on, what we find is that it doesn't really talk about homosexuality as we would understand it today, because Ezekiel makes it very clear, still in the Old Testament, by the way, when we are in the 16th chapter, where he says, "This was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride. They had excess food. They had prosperous ease. But they did not aid the poor and the needy. They were haughty. They did abominable things before me. Therefore I removed them when I saw it." You see how people throughout time have zeroed in on one thing that they think that text is about, but the prophet Ezekiel says, no. God says that the sin of the people of Sodom was that she and her daughters had excess pride. They had food and prosperity to share, but instead of welcoming the people with the hospitable nature that they were called to do, they did the entirely opposite. And they used these people, they took advantage of people in need, and they shall be judged for what they did. Similarly, when we go into the New Testament, we find other texts that reinterpret things that were previously understood in a different way. Let's look at, for example, when Jesus is talking to his disciples and he's teaching them, and the Sabbath day rolls around and they pick grain, or Jesus heals someone. And the Pharisees lose their minds because they say, "Don't you understand? Violation of the code of the Sabbath is absolutely paramount to who we are. You have violated the Sabbath, and you must face severe consequences for doing this. You of all people, a teacher, should know better." And Jesus does a 180 from what the Pharisees and many of the people in his time would have understood, and he says, "Let me make this clear for you. Was the Sabbath created for humanity, or was humanity created for the Sabbath?" He says, if you think it's the former or the latter, I think you've got this twisted. You got this confused. What you have done is you have started to worship the law and not the God who laid out the law. It says, let me make this plain for you. If a child falls down a well, wouldn't you rescue them even if it's on the Sabbath day? Of course you would. If an animal falls in there, wouldn't you rescue them? Of course you would. If somebody is suffering, wouldn't you come to their aid even if it's on the Sabbath day? Don't let the law have greater importance than how you care for your fellow human beings. That is the thing that should drive you. That should be the thing that is your guiding principle in all of this. We look at examples in the Bible where precious little is said, as I said earlier, about slavery, and that can be very troubling for us. We look at that and we say, well, how come there's no sort of moral stance against this? When in fact, in the time that the Bible was written, slavery was just a part of life that people weren't actively questioning. But thanks be to God, over time we have said, no, that doesn't stand up to the whole of the Scriptures. If we single out particular passages, I suppose we could justify it. But when we think about, does the Bible and do what we know about God's nature, and does Jesus' teaching seem to suggest that owning another person and abusing them feels right and just and good? Or does that stand in opposition to what we understand as the character of God and the teachings of Jesus? And over time, we got that right. So you have to sometimes look at the big picture in all of these. Same is true when it comes to the treatment of women. I mean, yes, you can find in the New Testament letters where it says that women should keep silent, women should be subservient, women should be treated like second-class citizens. But there's also letters written by Paul that talk about people like Phoebe, and they talk about people like Priscilla, and they talk about other women who end up taking a critical role in helping the new church get on its feet. In fact, if we look to some parts of the New Testament, we'll even see that maybe it was women who started some of the first churches. And if we look to the story of Lydia back in the city of Philippi as it was called, in Philippi, Lydia was probably the first woman to ever start a church on European soil. The first person, and it was a woman. So her leadership is celebrated. And I don't think Paul is saying, you can start a church and that's wonderful and we'll baptize you and your whole community, but don't say anything. That's not how it works, right? So we have to take the whole picture. Maybe there was something specific that was being addressed in one community, but the whole picture, the broader picture of Scripture, I think points to something different. Ryan read that lengthy passage from Acts, and I think that this is one of the most pivotal moments in all of Scripture to understand when a 180 takes place. Imagine yourself in the role of Peter. You are the disciple who Jesus sort of takes under his wing, not because I really think that Jesus loved Peter more, but sometimes a mentor sees an apprentice or a mentee that they see special gifts in. And they take a liking to them and sort of want to bring them up, and there's a tutelage process that becomes particularly pronounced. And I think that that's what's happening with Peter. Jesus takes Peter under his wings, and it's also one of those times where it feels like Jesus is particularly hard on Peter or rebukes him and calls him out in front of the other disciples. But I think it's one of those mentoring, coaching relationships where Jesus says, I know what you're capable of, and I'm just going to push you a little harder. And if it feels like I'm calling you out or picking on you, it's only because I see the potential in you. So he's got Peter under his wing. And Peter is now trying to do all the right things. He's trying to be faithful to what Jesus taught him. He's trying to be a good Jew. He's trying to follow all the rules and all the codes. He's trying to recite all the scriptures properly. And he's trying to do all the right things. And one of the things that he has been steeped in the tradition of what all Jews were these are the things that set us apart. We worship one God and one God only. We follow the commandments. We follow the law of Moses. We follow all of those rules and codes around eating correctly. And so there are rules about what you should eat and what you shouldn't eat, and these things are clean and these things are unclean, and if you eat these things accidentally, it will make you unclean for a period of time, and so forth. And all of a sudden, one day he has this vision where he is hungry, but he falls into a trance, it says, and he sees this vision of this giant sheet being lowered down from the heavens, and there's all these creatures on this blanket, on this sheet. And he hears God say, "Peter, kill and eat." And Peter, probably thinking this is a test, goes, "No. I know what the law says. I know what I'm not supposed to do, and I see unclean animals on here, and if this is a test, I am passing this. I am not eating that." And God says, "Nope. This is not a test. This is not a trick question. I'm saying I want you to do this. What I have made, you shall not call unclean any longer." And Peter says, "Yeah, still not doing it." And God says, "Yeah, you are." And he says, "Okay." And it's another time that Peter needs information in triplicate to get the point across. Remember, not too much early before this, Jesus says to Peter, "Do you love me? Do you love me? Do you love me?" Now he's saying, it's okay to eat it, it's okay to eat it, it's okay to eat it. And then all of a sudden, there's a knock on the door, and lo and behold, it's people who have been sent by this centurion named Cornelius, and Cornelius wants to be baptized because he wants to know more about God, and he is curious about this Jesus fellow, and he's eager to be baptized, and all of a sudden, it dawns on Peter, oh, this isn't about the animals at all. This is about God saying this new way of interpreting the scriptures means that everybody gets included. It's a 180 from where Peter started to where he is now. And he says, I get it. I get it. I'm grateful for these times in Scripture where the story is told in such a way that it helps us understand that sometimes Scripture is at a certain place in time and it's fixed from someone's point of view in a very specific situation and context. And we see that, and we can't help but see the world through the tiny lenses that we have in our space and time. But when we take that bigger step back and we look at the whole of Scripture, it oftentimes points to much larger truths than what look to be micro instances of particulars that we find in a passage or two or a story or two here and there. It reminds me of that quote from Martin Luther King Jr., where he says, "The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends toward justice." If we take that same approach to Scripture, what we will find is that we will be in the company of Jesus and the prophets, who oftentimes stood in opposition to what their local community was saying, and they were, by the way, very convinced that God was on their side in those moments. But they step back and say, no, look, what is the broader picture? Does this lead to justice? Does this lead to peace and a greater understanding of humanity with the people that we are called to live with? Does this look like the nature of the God that we served, who created out of love and joy and abundance and wants to share that grace with humanity? Does this seem to be something that Jesus would teach? Do I see someone who Jesus' heart would break for and find them being mistreated? And if so, can I step into that gap, and can I be a justice bringer, a peace bearer, a good news sharer? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves. And when we come across these passages in Scripture that feel problematic to us, we can courageously wrestle with them, because what we will find is that when we take the broader view and we look at the story of Scripture as a whole and the teaching of Jesus Christ and the nature of God, we will find that it bends towards justice, that it bends towards love, that it moves in the direction of inclusion. And that is why we don't toss these verses out. We don't set the Bible aside. We can instead embrace it, and we can say, this is about individuals and their experience of God, but on the whole, it teaches us powerfully about how we as people have understood, wrestled with, and continued to worship this God throughout the ages. It makes us stronger. It makes us more grace-filled. It leads us to be the just and caring church that we are called to be. And it reminds us all of our responsibility as wrestlers in this faith. Will you pray with me?